putneys, and then yeah, you can pick sometime during this, no later than here. But if you want to come up right when the person right before you goes up, that's fine too. Yeah, but I'll hand you the guitar. I'm gonna get some water. I'll be right back.
Erev Tov Ubari. May you have a healthy and a good evening. We gather tonight to observe this holy day of Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, a day of remembering the Holocaust and the heroism that comes from it. And as we begin our program tonight, there are a few necessary things we need to tell you. Both of you are here present with us in our sanctuary, and we are certainly grateful to see such a good turnout. And for those who are able to view us online, thank you for your presence whenever you are able to view this. Cantor Nami and myself, we welcome you to Temple Bethel on behalf of our Board of Trustees. For those who are viewing online, you will see a link to the program tonight, and you will also find a link to the prayer book. Here in our prayer book, we have little yellow booklets that will be, here in the sanctuary, we have little yellow booklets that will serve as our prayer book for tonight. Online, you can click on that link where it says service booklet, and then the program also will tell you who is going to be with us tonight participating in the service. And that will be followed, of course, by a lecture that we're so fortunate to have Jeffrey N. Gingold with us, the author of Tunnel, Smuggle, Collect, A Holocaust Boy. Also, please note that we're asking all of our speakers here tonight to maintain your masks on your face and nose and mouth as appropriate. If anyone here tonight does get confirmed with a positive COVID test within 5 days, we do request that you let us know at Temple. You can call us and speak to our executive director, Stephanie Kushner, and then we will, of course, keep your identity confidential, but we will be letting people know, as many people as we can, know that we had a positive person here with us. So that's how we do contact tracing here. Again, and we'll be using technology a little bit later on in the service, and this is especially for the people online. But later on in the service, we will be asking for names of people whom we shall be remembering on this night. And if you have a name of someone whom you are remembering, by 7:20 p.m., please, if you would type it into the comment section, and that information I will retrieve at some point from someone who's going to give it to me. So when I look at my cell phone, it's not that I'm checking the score, the Dodgers score or something like that. Sorry, the Brewers score. But I think that it's important that you know that our purpose here tonight is one of solemn gathering, solemn occasion. There will be people who will be reading parts in the service. You all know who you are. There are people who will be lighting candles here, our memorial candles as we have. And we thank all of you for participating in our service. Again, we gather at this solemn moment to remember our wounds from the Holocaust. We also gather at this precarious time in the world as we think about the invasion of Ukraine, only the latest insult against humanity. And of course, we never want to overlook the countless acts of heartless aggression and perhaps even genocide against other peoples, the Uyghur Muslims, the Chinese Christians, Rohingya Muslims, Rwandan Tutsis, the Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Muslims. We each can add to this list. The question we all ask ourselves is whether we will learn our lesson as a human family of how we can be part of the solution to cure the ills of prejudice rather than perpetuate them.
On the first page in our service booklets, you'll find the words for Ani Maamin. I want to actually begin with a slightly different tune than the one you may know, one that I learned indirectly from Elie Wiesel. Many people here will know of Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor who became famous for his writing and his political activism. This is a tune that Elie learned at a horrifying moment, that night when he was taken to Auschwitz. And so I'll begin with this melody that Elie preserved, and then we'll offer the tune that is more widely known. Ani mamin be'emuno shelemo bevias HaMoshiach. Ani mamin be'emuno shelemo bevias HaMoshiach. Ani mamin be'emuno shelemo bevias HaMoshiach. Ve'af al pi she'yismameha achakelo b'chol yom sheyavo. Ve'af al pi she'yismameha achakelo b'chol yom sheyavo. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin be'emuna shelema beviat HaMashiach. Beviat HaMashiach ani ma'amin. Ve'af al pi she'yitmameha achakelo b'chol yom sheyavo. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin be'emuna shelema beviat HaMashiach. Beviat HaMashiach ani ma'amin. Ve'af al pi she'yitmameha achakelo b'chol yom sheyavo.
We will now start lighting our memorial candles in honor and memory of our loved ones and the brothers and sisters of Israel. First candle will be lit by Dina Williams.
I'm lighting this candle for my parents, Avrom and Reisel Feldman. They were fighters. They were lucky they survived, but they lost two brothers that I never knew, my grandparents, many aunts and uncles, cousins, their entire families, with just a very few people remaining. So I light this candle in honor of those people who have, there's no one left.
The world of Eastern Europe rises before us, thousands upon thousands of little children learning Torah, homes in which the Sabbath candles brightly burned, streets where walkers argued points of law and where the outside world was far away. There was poverty and lack of vision, too, but there was a depth and a greatness which we have no longer, and we weep for what is lost. Ve'ata tetzaveh et bnei Yisrael v'yikchu elecha shemen zach katit lama or leha'alot ner tamid. You shall command the people of Israel to have them bring you clear olive oil, made from olives that were crushed for lighting, to keep the lamp burning constantly.
I call up Louise Elbaum to do the second candle.
So I'm lighting this candle in honor of my late husband and also Renata Laxova, a good friend, both of whom experienced the Holocaust in different ways. Nathan, as he used to say, a guest of the Germans, and Renata as a child refugee. Both of them, however, took from it profound respect for their fellow human beings, a delight in finding cases of human caring and kindness, and great pleasure in discovering the values in others.
And there was Western Europe, where Jewish life had flowered into a golden period of creativity. Scholars, poets, merchants, artists, and musicians joined ancient and modern visions in a joyous celebration of life. The world had a special glow, and genius resided within the Jewish community. Then, creation was followed by destruction. Ki ner mitzvah v'torah, or v'derech hayim tochot musar. For the commandment is a lamp, the teaching is a light, and the way to life is the rebuke that disciplines.
Thank you. Our third candle is Michael Goldrosen.
So while my father and grandfather were fortunate enough to survive the Holocaust, most of their family did not. Most specifically, I light this candle today in memory of my grandmother Zelda, who of course I never knew, and my uncle Abraham. Abraham was only 1 year old when he and his mother were captured and taken away.
There is the Sephardic world as well, a poised culture, a quiet and enduring way of Jewish life, 1,000 years of scholarships, of family life and joy. In Athens and Salonika, in the Mela and on the isles of the Mediterranean, Jews prayed to God and trusted their neighbors, and that world also ceased. Kitov, Sarah, Lo yichbeh Velila Nera. Her wares are excellent, and her lamp never goes out at night.
Our fourth candle is Erica Gordon.
Thank you for this honor. I'm here to represent my father, Harry Gordon. He wrote the book called The Shadow of Death. He also spent some time with Elie Wiesel in Auschwitz, and then he got shipped to Dachau. And he also wrote a book in Yiddish, and that book is in the Memorial Library in Washington, D.C., the Holocaust there. My mom, she hid with a Polish family for all those years, but she lost all her family, as did my father, lost all his family. Thank you.
As darkness covered the Jewish world, fire burned the books and the buildings. Night and fog swallowed up the people on their way to death. We weep for them, we yearn for them now. Near la argali daver vo or la lina tivati. Your words of Torah are a lamp to my foot and a light for my pathway.
Mark Eisenberg.
Hi, my parents came from Germany. They were refugees. My dad, Norbert, was born in Saarbrücken. He came over in October 38. My mom, Edith Sternheim, she was born in Stuttgart. She came over in March 1939. She was a witness to Kristallnacht, and her father was arrested.
As we look at these lights, try to imagine 6 million candles, each one with the name of another Jew. Each one would signify a unique and precious soul who struggled and had hope, who was a part of a family, an orphan, a widow, or a widower. They worked, studied, took walks, the ordinary things of life. They celebrated births and b'nai mitzvah and weddings. They mourned at funerals. All were a part of the Jewish people. Each one was a separate individual. Each one suffered, and each one perished. And each and every one perished. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. The human spirit is the light of God.
I call up Jenny Pressman for the sixth candle.
I light this candle in memory of my parents, Alina Kaplan Pressman and Ignash Pressman, who survived the Warsaw Ghetto and in hiding and in Gross Rosen and other camps, who were members of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and when they came to the United States in the 1950s, helped to form the WAGR, the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Organization, dedicated to remembering the bravery and the lives of so many millions of Jews killed, including 3 of the grandparents and so many other relatives who were killed that I never met.
We reach toward them through the stories of lives by reciting their names. Chava, Zahra, Ezekiel, Yehuda. Their names, their lives are intertwined with ours. They are part of our collective memories, of our history. the Warsaw Ghetto alongside the walls of Jerusalem, the musicians of Auschwitz and the still harps at the waters of Babylon, the murdered temple singers and the children of Terezin. They speak to us softly from Baba Yar and from all the transports. V'yomer Elohim yehi or vayehi or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light.
And now we have a separate seventh candle. I call it Becca Schwartz.
They were killed by bullets, trying to hide from the violence that targeted them for years. They were murdered by starvation, having subsisted for longer than thought possible on a diet of adulterated bread and polluted water. It mattered not their education, nor their status. All were considered enemies of the state. Some, of course, had no education because they were too young. Children whose last shouts were gasps as the gas filled their lungs and destroyed their tiny bodies. Their numbers could not be counted. There were so many. They gathered together by circumstance or necessity. Their resources were pitifully small, but no help came, while the armies of the brutish and vengeful took their houses, their properties, their identities, and finally their lives. In the sky, bombs were traded for birds, and screaming projectiles replaced sweet and bitter songs. How should we respond to this carnage and terror we saw flourishing in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Syria, Iraq, Darfur, Afghanistan, and now in Ukraine? How can we, scarred by a horror we felt 3 generations ago, change the world now? Let us turn to history, share money and time, demand justice, work for peace, shout the story, and perhaps, first of all these, welcome the refugee. Adonai ori v'ishi, mimi iri, Adonai ma'oz chayai, mimi echad. The Eternal is my light and my help. Whom shall I fear? The Eternal God is the strength of my life. Who shall frighten me?
We begin with silence. The silence of the death, the silence of life, the silence after destruction, the silence before creation. There are times when songs falter, when darkness fills life, when martyrdom becomes a constellation of faith against the unrelieved black of space about us. There are no words to reach beyond the edge of night. No messengers to tell the full tale. There is only silence. The silence of Job. The silence of the 6 million. The silence of memory. Let us remember them as we link our silences into the silence which becomes a prayer, which links us with the past, touching that darkness we cannot fully enter, the anguish which is memory and love and life and death.
Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. Blessed is the heart with strength to stop its beating for honor's sake. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Hannah Sinesh. Here in the carload, I am Eve with my son Abel. If you see my other son Cain, the son of man, tell him that I, Dan Pagus. I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love even when feeling it not. I believe in God even when God is silent, found on a cellar wall in Cologne, Germany. If the prophets broke in through the doors of night and sought an ear like a homeland, ear of mankind overgrown with nettles, would you hear? If the voice of the prophets blew on flutes made of murdered children's bones and exhaled airs burnt with the martyrs' cries, if they build a bridge of old men's dying groans, ear of mankind occupied with small sounds, would you hear? Nellie Sachs.
This passage is in memory of my parents, Suzy and Kurt Rodan, and my aunt Edate. May she rest in peace. May they all rest in peace. They were my teachers. It is also in memory of my grandparents, my paternal great-grandparents, my great aunts, uncles, and cousins who all perished in the Shoah. My God, are the doors really being shut now? Yes, they are. Shut on the herded, densely packed mass of people inside. Through small openings at the top, we can see heads and hands. Hands that will wave to us later when the train leaves. The commandant takes its bicycle and rides once again along the entire length of train. Then he makes a brief gesture like royalty in an operetta. The little orderly comes flying up and deferentially relieves him of the bicycle. The train gives a piercing whistle, and 1,020 Jews leave Holland. This time the quota was really quite small, all considered. A mere 1,000 Jews, the extra 20 being reserves. For it is always possible, indeed quite certain this time, that a few will die or be crushed to death on the way. So many sick people and not a single nurse. The tide of helpers gradually recedes. People go back to their sleeping quarters. So many exhausted, pale, and suffering faces. One more piece of our camp has been amputated. Next week, yet another piece will follow. This is what has been happening now for over a year, week in, week out. We are left with just a few thousand. Eddie Hillesum in an excerpt from her diary.
Please join me. Eli, Eli, shelo yegamer leolam, achol bechayam,
It was the cold winter of 1944 in a miserable little concentration camp, grotesquely called Liberosa. My father took me and some of our friends to a corner in the barracks. He announced that it was the eve of Hanukkah, produced a curious-shaped clay bowl, and began to light a wick immersed in his precious but now melted margarine ration. Before he could recite the blessing, I protested at this waste of food. He looked at me, then at the lamp, and finally said, "You and I have seen that it is possible to live up to 3 weeks without food. We once lived almost 3 days without water, but you cannot live properly for 3 minutes without hope." I would like to be able to end the story of another miracle. I would like to, but I can't. Unless it is that our guards did not see our little celebration. But that could be because the margarine had more water in it than fat. And after some spluttering and smoke, the little flame went out. Nor did my father survive. I like to think that his spirit, which went all the way back to Abraham, is in me too, and has gone into my children. That too is a miracle of sorts.
I dedicate this reading for my mother, Faye, who arrived in New York in 1948 on the SS General Black at 7 years old after living over 3 years in the Zalsheim displaced persons camp in Germany, waiting unsuccessfully to go to Palestine. For my grandma, Sarah, who fled Bessarabia in 1941, one day before the Nazis invaded her town. With bombs falling overhead during her flight, she stopped to give birth to my mother in Novy Odessa, Ukraine. For my mother's father, Chaim, who she never had the chance to meet when the Germans invaded, the Romanian or Russian army took him and the other men in the village to fight, and he died of military wounds. For my grandpa, Misha, who escaped out the back door when German soldiers came looking for him in Warsaw without a chance to say goodbye. He was the only member of his family to survive, spending the war years in Ukraine and Uzbekistan. He met and married my grandmother, a widower with a young child, my mother, and built a family that grew to include 2 more children, my aunt and uncle. It's hard to breathe and read. And for my mother's extended family, beloved grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, siblings, cousins, those who survived, and the many who perished before their time at the hands of the Nazis, each with a name and a story to remember. All took leave from life in the manner with which most suited them, some praying, some deliberately drunk, others lustfully intoxicated for the last time. But the mothers stayed up to prepare the food for the journey with tender care and washed their children and packed the luggage. And at dawn, the barbed wire was full of children's washing hung out in the wind to dry. Nor did they forget the diapers, the toys, the cushions, and the hundreds of other small things which mothers remember and which children always need. Would you not do the same if you and your children were going to be killed tomorrow? Would you not give him to eat today? Primo Levi.
This is not Rabbi Lori Zimmerman with me. This is my wife, Kimberly Wilson. Rabbi Zimmerman is not feeling well and judiciously decided to take care of herself tonight. We wish her speedy recovery. I've had the honor of reading this poem many years here at this observance, and I don't think I've ever said why I'm reading it. So I just want to mention my mother, Wanda Lavendel Binzer, and my father, Adam Binzer, both survivors. My mother was a hidden child. She was born in 1930, so she was 9 when the Nazis invaded Poland. She lived in Warsaw. My stepfather from Krakow, Poland. It's a long story, but they met after the war and fell in love, and here we are. So Kimberly Wilson will read with me this amazing poem by Irene Klepfitz called Beschert. These words are dedicated to those who died. These words are dedicated to those who died because they had no love and felt alone in the world.
Because they were afraid to be alone and tried to stick it out.
Because they could not ask.
Because they were shunned.
Because they were sick and their bodies could not resist the disease.
Because they played it safe.
Because they had no connections.
Because they had no faith.
Because they felt they did not belong and wanted to die.
These words are dedicated to those who died. Because they were loners and liked it.
Because they acquired friends and drew others to them.
Because they took risks.
Because they were stubborn and refused to give up.
Because they asked for too much.
These words are dedicated to those who died because a card was lost and a number was skipped.
Because a bed was denied.
Because a place was filled and no other place was left.
These words are dedicated to those who died because someone did not follow through.
Because someone was overworked and forgot.
Because someone left everything to God.
Because someone was late.
Because someone did not arrive at all.
Because someone told them to wait and they just couldn't any longer.
These words are dedicated to those who died because death is a punishment.
Because death is a reward.
Because death is the final rest.
Because death is eternal rage.
These words are dedicated to those who died.
Beschert. These words are dedicated to those who survived.
These words are dedicated to those who survived because their second grade teacher gave them books.
Because they did not draw attention to themselves and got lost in the shuffle.
Because they knew someone who knew someone else who could help them and bumped into them on a corner on a Thursday afternoon.
Because they played it safe.
Because they were lucky.
These words are dedicated to those who survived because they knew how to cut corners.
Because they drew attention to themselves and always got picked.
Because they took risks.
Because they had no principles and were hard.
These words are dedicated to those who survived because they refused to give up and defied statistics.
Because they had faith and trusted in God.
Because they expected the worst and were always prepared.
Because they were angry.
Because they could ask.
Because they mooched off others and saved their strength.
Because they endured humiliation.
Because they looked the other way.
These words are dedicated to those who survived because life is a wilderness and they were savage.
Because life is an awakening and they were alert.
Because life is a flowering and they blossomed.
Because life is a struggle and they struggled.
Because life is a gift and they were free to accept it.
These words are dedicated to those who survived.
Beschert.
Beschert.
A man named Hirsch Glick, who was born in 1920 in Vilna. When Soviets freed Lithuania, Glick frequently contributed his songs to the Jewish Soviet newspapers. During the German occupation, he found himself in a concentration camp near Vilna. And in 1943, the Jews in the camp were transferred to the Vilna ghetto, and Glick joined the partisan camp in the ghetto. The partisan staff distributed this song, Zog nit kein Mol, to be used as a hymn. When the ghetto was liquidated, Glick didn't show up to join his partisan comrades because the Gestapo had intercepted him and sent him to the concentration camp in Estonia. When the Red Army began its assault on the Baltic countries, Glick escaped from his camps into the nearby woods, where he died in the struggle against the Germans. We can join together if you know it. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Hoscht Himmeln bleien, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen Wetter noch unter euch gebänkte Schau. Das Wetter pockt und unser Trott mir seinen do. Kommen wird noch unser euch gebänkte Schau. Das Wetter pockt und unser Trott mir seinen do. Never say you have reached the very end, when leaden skies a bitter future may portend. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arrive, and our marching steps will thunder we survive. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arrive, and our marching steps will thunder we survive. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, Hosch Himmeln bleien, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, es wird abheugt und unser Trott mir seinen do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, es wird abheugt und unser Trott mir seinen do.
My dedication is to my parents, who are the sole survivors of their immediate family. My father surviving the war as a partisan. My mother survived in the Lukov ghetto and then was hidden by a Polish family. They both made their way to Bad Reichenhall DP camp, where I was born. The dry bones. There I stood on a little hill in the Auschwitz death camp, surrounded by blocks and barracks where inmates lived, suffered, died under the black smokestacks of the ovens, encircled by stark whiteness of snow and ash and bone. The Polish guide explained, the grass on these plains grows abundantly in summer and spring, blue grass fed by the fertilizer under the soil. Come back after winter and see how lovely it is. There I stood, praying the ashes could somehow cohere, recalling the question posed to Ezekiel in the valley, can these bones live? After there came a noise, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to this bone, the sinews and the flesh upon them, and the skin covered them above, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come out of your graves, and bring you to the land of Israel. There I stood on a lofty mountain in Jerusalem. Before me, the vast host of the Jewish people, in schoolrooms, in cities, in factories, in villages, in battle, in peace. God, remember the souls of the departed, and guard over the resurrected children of Israel in the land of Israel. Rabbi Moshe Weiss.
These are the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. At no time has the earth been so soaked with blood. The vision of the sacred has all but died in the soul of man. There is a divine dream which the prophets and rabbis have cherished and which fills our prayers and permeates the acts of true piety. It is the efforts of man by his dedication to the task of establishing the kingship of God in the world. God is waiting for us to redeem the world. We should not spend our life hunting for trivial satisfactions, while God is waiting constantly and keenly for our effort and opportunities to satisfy our greed, envy, and ambition. We have not survived that we may waste our years in vulgar vanities. The martyrdom of millions demands that we consecrate ourselves to the fulfillment of God's dream of salvation. Tonight we have mentioned the names of many dear ones. I now would like to add to this list of people whom we remember at this time. We remember Odette Sananis, the Radbill and Manuta family members who perished in Babi Yar and other communities. Alice Remack Simon, Les Goldsmith's grandfather, Heinz Aschkowitz, killed at Buchenwald. Zeli Adler, Marcel Baum, Alex Baum, Eva Deutschkron, Martin Deutschkron, Kunigude Deutschkron, Alfred Deutschkron, Hilde Deutschkron, Heinz Deutschkron, Razel Feldman, Avram Feldman, the Usher Goldstern family, 25 members who perished at the Brest ghetto and at the Bronaya Gora massacre site. David Greenbaum, the Groinum family, Alice Hanau, Gertruda Hanau, Hilda Hanau, Albert Hanau, Philip Hirsch, Hugo Hirsch, Hedwig Hirschhorn, Richard Hirschhorn, Ruth Hirschhorn, Laura Yosef, Isidore Yosef, Aharon, the child of Yehudit Kamener, the children of Ben Sion Karsh, who are Rachel Yehudit Shalom and Mordecai, Carl Cohorn, the children of Alexander Landy, Chane Hanan and Arya Velve, Emil Lowy, Irma Lowy, Gertrude Lowy, Hannah Messenger, Imre Messenger, Julia Podgers, Jerry Podgers, Satz family, a child of Penina Shapira, Chaim Bar Mordechai, and the Weirnick family. There may be others in this community who, for whatever reason, wish to add to this list of memory, and if you would like to do so, we invite you to do so as I sweep around the room.
Trudy Berger, Yanni and Emil Franken.
Toby Jacoby.
Yes.
Vanya and Jake Heifetz.
My parents.
Who's the photo?
And their first spouses were murdered at Auschwitz, along with 4 children and numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins.
Bertha Anoswe Kaplan and Yeshua Prison.
In the memory of these whom we have named, and in the memory of all those whom we know who have perished, we now invite the community to rise for El Maleh Rachamim, a special El Maleh Rachamim meditation for this particular occasion.
Shochel b'meromim hamitzei menucha nechona בכנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. לנשמות 6,000,000 אחיותינו ואחינו אשר נספו בשואה, שנהרגו ושנשחטו, שנחנקו ושנקברו חיים, שנשרפו ושעונו, ילדים וזקנים, נשים וגברים. לנשמות בני דתות ועמים רבים, שנפלו קורבן לתאוות הרשע הנאצית, ובהם מתנגדי המשטר הרצחני, הומוסקסואלים ולסביות, צוענים, בעלי נכויות בגוף ובנפש, עם רבים אחרים שלא נמצאו ראויים לחיים. בעל הרחמים, הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. בגן עדן תמנוחתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם. וינוחו בשלום על פזורי משכבותם, ונאמר Amen.
May God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, provide perfect rest for the souls of the 6 million who died as Jews in the flames of the Shoah, those who were slain for their devotion to you, our brothers and sisters in every generation killed because they were Jews, the ones who suffered fire and the ones who suffered water, to sanctify only your name. Let there be perfect rest for the countless millions of others who died because of race, religion, or nationality, political affiliation, or sexual orientation. Hold them close forever. Seal their souls for everlasting life in the shelter of your presence, for you are their eternal home. And together we say, Amen.
Amen.
We read together this Kaddish penned by Elie Wiesel as we remember the resting places of many of our loved ones whom we have mentioned tonight. We go back and forth. Each of us can do the Hebrew or Aramaic and the English. We can all do this together. Yit Gadal, Lodge, V'yit Kadash, Gurs, Shemei Rabbah, Orsha, Be'alma di V'ra Chirutei, Bogdanovka, V'yimlach Malchutei, Ravensbrück, B'chayechon Uvyomechon, Vilna, Uv'chaye Dechol Beit Yisrael, Treblinka, Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv, Chelno, V'imru, Amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mevarach Le'alam Ul'almei Almaya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach Belzek. V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam Buchenwald. V'yitnaseh V'yithadar Sobibor. V'yit'aleh V'yithalal Maidanek. Shemei Dekudsha Richu Mauthausen. Le'ela Babiyar. Min kol birchata v'shirata Bergen-Belsen. Tushbechata v'nechemata Dachau. Amiran be'alma Auschwitz. v'imru. Amen. Yehi shalama rabba min shmaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru. Amen. We remain standing as we close with Hatikva. Hatikva.
Kol od balevav penima, nefesh Yehudi omiyah, ulfate mizrach adima, ayin et Zion Sophia.
This service of observance is now ended, and we sincerely thank all of those who participated. I would also like to thank especially Livia Asher, who coordinated this service tonight and who puts it together so beautifully over the last few years. Thank you so much, Livia. I would now like to introduce Alan Klugman, the director of the Jewish Federation, who may guide us into the next part of our program tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Again, my thanks to Temple Bethel, to Livia. We try every year when we commemorate Yom HaShoah to not only have a service, but to have some sort of a speaker. Jeffrey Gingold is here with us tonight. I'm not going to do an introduction. You have it in front of you on the flip side of the program. On behalf of the Federation, we want to welcome him to our community and thank him for coming.
Thank you for the introduction to be here tonight. I could go down shorter. No.
Your knees will not appreciate it.
Okay.
I think that's good.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you again for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to share with you a deep concern that I have. I'm concerned about the term Holocaust turning into a disaster cliche. When it's said as a cliche, it weakens its meaning and fuels its deniers. The Holocaust is not a disastrous sporting event. A Holocaust does not describe a political upset or a financial decline. It's been used that way. You can look it up. The Holocaust, of course, is the mass murder of Jews under the German Nazi regime, period. The Holocaust is one of the most well-documented periods in history and never should be watered down. But maintaining the truth, I believe, takes a very resilient effort. My family's resilience was born in their survival and escape from the Warsaw Ghetto. Their resilience, I see it as a chain of custody to be handed to me and to hand down to each generation with the obligation to carry it forward. In September 1939, Warsaw would be bombed by the Germans, and it crumbled on top of its residents, Jews and non-Jews. They died in their streets and in their homes. My grandparents told me at the time they had two options. They could either wait out the shelling and invasion and think of it as just another land grab, or they could run for their life. And they decided to do that during the bombing of Warsaw. My grandparents, Leah and David, took their young family, which included my father, who was about 7 years old at the time, along with her brother and sister. And they decided to run with tens of thousands of other Polish citizens during the bombing and the buildings collapsing, get out of the city. Except there was one more challenge. At the time, the Germans began to bomb Warsaw the very day my grandmother went into labor with her second child. The Jewish hospital would be hit and it would be leveled, but my grandmother gave birth to another son, her second son. That's resilience in my view. It's no small task to flee Warsaw with a city's population in the midst of bombing. It wasn't allowed by the Germans. Simple as that. I'd like to read to you a section about that day. My grandfather, they didn't know where they were going other than get out of the city. If this is Poland, they knew not to go to Germany because the Germans were bombing them. So why would you go that way? So they thought to head towards the Russian border, which was quite a distance. But they thought, just let's get out of here. They left the city. They knew they were out of the city because cement roads and streets turned into dirt roads in the rural areas. So this is David, my grandfather, and Leah, my grandmother, 1 day old baby. They swaddled him up. She walked about as slow as a person would walk a day after giving birth, and sort of just shuffled along with the crowds pushing. And this is what happened. Suddenly, David stopped and stood tall in his tracks. Something had caught his ear, and he spun around. Fixing his gaze on the distant smoke-filled sky, he saw the city of Warsaw lying in ruins like a collapsed mountain range. But he looked beyond the unimaginable demolition that they had left behind. The columns of fleeing Warsaw residents behind them extended out of sight. David squinted off in the distance, and his eyes opened wide with terror. The remote, low drone of the bombers had been replaced by a high-pitched whistle that raced down toward them. "Run for cover, yelled David, into those trees." The new planes were smaller than the bombers and seemed faster and closer to the ground. The cutting echo of guttural screaming spun down the road toward them. David could see the first two planes come in low toward the long procession and begin firing directly into the lines of pedestrians. The shells struck like sprayed lightning strikes, hitting in a rapid-fire row with a popping sound, moving forward with the direction of the plane. The bullets came too fast for anyone to leap out of the way at the last second. Frozen in place and struggling to inhale, young Sam witnessed the shredding of souls who hadn't made it in time. Those who could run quickly had scattered away from the road and into the fields. Dozens of elderly and infirm individuals were struck from behind and fell in place with their belongings still in hand. The speed of the incoming shells was as instant as light cuts through the air and caught many off guard. They died, their bodies bleeding on the road, while others lay wounded and calling for help. Since there was no medical care for the injured, David wondered if the lucky ones were those who had been killed instantly rather than left to writhe in pain and eventually die in front of their relatives. The dirt road reached out of Warsaw like a bloody arm, strewn with dropped bodies and belongings. David felt that they had witnessed a mass execution. There was no time to grieve. Now, these were intentional strafings. How do we know that? Because the planes, my dad told me this over and over again, after they strafed a row of pedestrians, they came around again and again. So it wasn't a mistake. My grandmother and family, they would walk slowly, 20, 30 meters. They hear the high-pitched whistle, and into the ditches, cover up by weeds, cover up anything they could, dump on top of themselves and hide until the sound was gone of the shooting. Get up again, another 20 or 30 meters, over and over and over. That's resilience, too. The surviving Jews were stopped by the Germans before they got to the border with the Russians. They were put on trucks and they were forced to go back to Warsaw, to what would become the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, any Jew found outside the ghetto was immediately shot and killed. How crowded was the ghetto? Each room, about the size of your bedroom figure, had 7 to 9 people living in it. Now, these were not all your relatives necessarily, as the Germans swept across Europe and scooped up Romanian Jews, Hungarian Jews. They all poured them in to the Warsaw Ghetto and other ghettos. These were holding pens. They were not designed for you to live there. They were designed to hold you until you could be exterminated somehow. There was no heat, no food, no baths, no showers, no washing. My family lived in one room. My grandparents, my father, my grandmother's brother and sister, and a baby, one room. To use the bathroom, there was a grate in the corner of the room, in the floor. You sort of lose all modesty, even with your family, having to exist like that. After months and months of starvation, disease, merciless beatings, street executions with the bodies just left in the gutters, and mass graves, my family was desperate to survive, and they had no choice but to risk it all. Many children smuggled They smuggled for food. They did it in between the bricks of the wall. My father went through tunnels that were hand dug by my grandfather and other gentlemen at night, after midnight, after they had worked their slave labor all day. They did this at night. Why did they use children? Well, think about it. How hard it would be to dig a tunnel for someone as tall as me. My grandfather was taller. Children, you don't have to dig as large of a tunnel because they can just crawl through. Parents who let their children smuggle for food, this wasn't sandwiches, this was rotten bits of vegetables, rotted tomatoes, potatoes, turnips, whatever the Polish black market could scoop up in exchange for gold and watches and earrings and things like that, enough to survive. Parents knew that if the children were found outside of the ghetto, they would be shot and killed unceremoniously. There was no trial, no lawyers, no hearing. You were dead. They knew that their children often would not return, and they couldn't ask the Germans what happened to their children. You don't want to be attached to that. I'd like to read one more section about the time that my father was tagged to join the smuggling effort. He was about 8 years old at the time. They went into one of the secret locations where one of the tunnel entrances existed, and that wasn't really told to anybody who didn't need to know. They all knew that being caught meant never being seen again. Others in the meetings would confirm that they had younger brothers or sons who never came back. Relatives didn't want to ask the Germans and draw attention to the fact that they were related to someone who was taken. It was the constant fear of being next. After midnight, several men gathered with the collected items and lists in the dark basement near one of the hidden wall openings. "You will be fine with him," said David, "since Yankel has done this many times." He embraced Sam and gave him a kiss on his forehead. "If there's any problem, you can't ask for help." Sam's father continued, "Drop everything, run fast, and don't look back." The dim basement light covered David's deep frown and pressed lips as he turned his eyes away. "And don't give any openings away," instructed Yankel. "Just run 10 feet away and hide." Even though he was only a teenager, Yankel walked with the experience of someone twice his age and spoke with the calm of having done this his whole life. "You will always be with someone who knows the ropes of how to move and stay hidden." Yankel looked deep into Sam's eyes and spoke intensely about his role and what he must not do. Once they started in the tunnel, he didn't want to be bothered or hear anything from Sam. "Sei still, not a word." Yankel made it clear that only he would be doing any talking and that silence was vital. Sam blinked in agreement. Do exactly what he tells you and stay quiet," said David. Sam noticed that most of the others in the room had suddenly disappeared, leaving him with David, Yankel, and one other man. It was critical to keep the secret knowledge about the entrance to a minimum. There was a concern that if the Germans took someone away who knew the secrets, names, hidden places, and activities, it would expose all the people in the building and the neighborhood to collective Gestapo punishment. Sam felt a hand on the side of his head. A man with a puffy, dark beard and sideburns knelt down in front of him. "Hold still so I can get this on you," whispered the deep voice. The cold mud covered Sam's face, his hands, his nails, while his dark clothes hid any exposed skin that might reflect light. The man pulled down Sam's black knit cap to cover his neck and his ears. As he turned in the tunnel opening and grasped the bags and lists, Sam noticed his father silently wiping his eyes. The uncle tapped his shoulder and pointed toward the wall. The German plan was to end Jewish existence. As my grandfather always mentioned, I asked, "Well, how did you live? How'd you do this?" The only thing they could do was plan for the day. They couldn't plan a week ahead of time, months ahead of time. They planned to get to the end of the day and maybe see the morning. Similarly, I suggest that one of the best ways for us to face disturbing efforts to rewrite Holocaust history is with that same vigilance. Where deniers are vindictive with their doubt, we shall share recorded testimony from survivors as well as the perpetrators and the liberators, where they say, "It never happened." We shall present testimonies, photos, and film. Please don't fool yourself believing that it is enough to just personally remember. Is it enough to say, members of my family were survivors and attend Yom HaShoah gatherings? Is it enough to visit Yad Vashem and have seen Schindler's List maybe 3 or 4 times? It's a start. But I fear that without vigilance to maintain the truth, the relevance of the Holocaust will fade in time. I ask myself, they're gone. But what would my relatives say about remembering the Holocaust if they were here now? If they were sitting there, what would they say? Thinking about my family enduring the Warsaw Ghetto, I see my grandfather hand-digging tunnels, my grandmother trying to nurse an infant, my father smuggling, risking his life for rotted food. After their escape, I see them all hiding from the Gestapo in the frozen woods of Eastern Europe. What would they say now? Through my grandfather's open fist and my grandmother's embrace, they would offer that remembering is like reading the 4 questions. Remember Passover? Not so long ago. We say the 4 questions every year at Passover. My grandparents would say these lessons must be repeated, not merely to remember, but to share the brutal truth of what happened. Not to just hold candles, but to strike down falsehoods with spotlight on the facts of what happened. Not to silently be grateful to yourself, but to openly relish family and the future some say about talking to the Holocaust to those who get it is preaching to the choir. But I believe that even the best choirs need to be tuned up once in a while, my opinion. For our collective survival, we must reject complacency. How? Now, whoever published the Haggadah that you were reading from maybe a week or so ago, it speaks of how, somewhere in there, how as Jews, we should recall the liberation from bondage. Does that sound familiar? While that occurred thousands of years ago, we are charged to remember it as if we were in Egypt and as if we were liberated. It led me to one simple conclusion regarding our pledge to remember the Exodus. We should also recall the Shoah with the same reverence as if we survived a Nazi-controlled ghetto or concentration camp. Remember it as if we were there. Now, inaction means others get to write our history, leaving the world to believe that they had a license to murder. I don't believe that. Perhaps look up there. Whether you call it a shul, a temple, a congregation, they tend to have an eternal light above the ark. That's vigilance and resilience too. May we continue to keep it lit, remembering our faith, clinging to community and our humanity. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Anybody have a question?
One of the things mentioned in your biography was your concern about rising anti-Semitism. I would be interested in your speaking of that and why you think it's occurring, if I'm correct in my assumption.
Why I think rising anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
I think they're those who are deniers, and I've met quite a few of them. They're a bit afraid of us. And they think that only by repeating the lie and saying it never happened, that's the best way to put us out, to throw doubt at us. Because as soon as they say that, the burden seems to shift to us to prove what we already know happened, what history already knows, what's been recorded, and that's what they're trying to do, to shift it. But I just stand by, it's the most documented. Even the perpetrators admit it. You watch the Nuremberg trials, they don't deny that it happened. They may deny that they were responsible or that they were ordered to, I was just following orders, but they don't say, no, Jews weren't killed. So I don't like to go into those arguments deeply, but we have to keep repeating what we know and repeating the truth, because I don't think they're going away. I hope that makes sense.
Clearly, your grandparents and your father, and I guess your uncle, survived. And I'm curious, you didn't really touch upon how they actually were able to get out and actually survive and come to the United States. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
How they survived, they were fortunate in the ghetto. When people died, families got the clothing of the people who left. Often when people were dying, my father told me stories of people who had passed and they had a bit of food. They would pass it to my grandmother, my grandfather, because there was a baby and they knew she had to nurse So it was important to keep her alive so the baby would survive, so somebody might remember someday what happened. How they got out, not the first attempt, they got out, I'll try not to go on too long, they ended up using the tunnels, the same tunnels that they used to smuggle for food. That's how they got out of the ghetto. Now, where were the tunnels? The tunnels were hand dug in the one place the Germans did not patrol. Where else would you not think of patrolling in Warsaw? The cemetery. They dug through a Christian cemetery until they got under the wall and out to freedom. They ended up living in the woods for many weeks, ended up going to Siberia eventually, and waited out the war in Siberia, Uzbekistan, some other places, and then they made their way backwards. That's the short version. Here is the longer version.
Anybody else?
Did the members of your family who survived go back to Warsaw or Poland at any point? Have you been, and what were those experiences like?
Has any member of my family gone back? No, I asked my dad when he was alive, he passed several years ago, if he wanted to go back. He said no. He said the neighborhood is gone. Their apartment building was blown to bits. There was nothing there. The building that they were put into in the Warsaw Ghetto, it was a lower basement apartment, and he didn't know if it existed. He said, but nobody's alive. No one's there. There are no good memories to go chase. Why go back? Would I like to go? Yes, there are some plans in the works, and I would love to touch. They have one or two parts of the wall that still exist. I think of that.
I've heard a lot of people kind of making analogies regarding Ukraine to the Holocaust, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
What I find interesting about Ukraine, hopefully I'm not the only one, it's sort of a reverse in my mind. When my family got out, they didn't get along with a lot of anti-Semitism that existed in the city of Warsaw at the time. That, again, is in the book. But in the foreign country, they were helped. The Polish people stepped forward, risked their lives. They hid in barns, they hid in haystacks. They got scraps of food from people who didn't really have food to share. And when I think of those Polish people who gave of themselves to help strangers, it's all in black and white in my mind. And now I'm watching the Polish people again. It's in color, but they're helping refugees coming from the other direction. I see a real parallel. I think it's very strong.
Jeffrey, on behalf of the Federation and our entire community, we want to thank you for sharing your story with us. And we want to thank you all for coming and for remembering. And I think this evening we leave here with a charge. And our charge is to remember not only today, but every day, and to come back next year and remember again and again and again. And once again, I thank everybody for coming.